Claudia Gonzalez opened her eyes slowly and looked around the back of the van in which she was riding. What met her eyes came as no surprise. It was a continuation of a journey she'd begun more than 1,700 miles before. Too many unwashed bodies in too small of a space for too long of a time. Meager possessions crammed into a bag or a backpack. An invisible veil hung over all of it. A palpable mixture of hope, desperation, and despair. Claudia looked at the man closest to her and asked, more with her eyes than her lips, "Agua?" He shook his head sadly and pointed to his empty water bottle. Claudia nodded silently. As much as she wanted a drink of water, she would have sacrificed that for a view outside the cramped vehicle in which she'd been riding. "How did you end up here?" she asked her traveling companion. "The same as you," came the reply. "Some of the details are different, but it's pretty much the same story. I left Guatemala, not because I wanted to, but because I would have died if I had remained." Then he went quiet. "You're a wise man," thought Claudia. "Best not to divulge too much to anyone. And you're right, the details change, but the big picture remains the same." Claudia was what many in the United States referred to as an illegal alien. While she wasn't familiar with that designation herself, she knew, if only in vague terms, about the anger directed at immigrants who flocked across the southern borders of the U.S. in hopes of a new life. The hard, cold fact was that she, and the others with her in the van, had indeed entered the country illegally. They had struggled to reach the U.S. border, driven by conditions that forced them against their wishes from their homes. All Claudia and those traveling with her cared about was finding a place to live and work without fear of the cartels that were the de facto rulers of much of Central America. Thinking about her question to the man with no water, Claudia asked herself, "How did I end up here?" In her mind, she went back several months in time. What else did she have to do on this endless drive to a place she was sure she'd never heard of? Most Americans would have assumed that she was a Mexican woman fleeing the poverty of Mexico for a better life, a piece of the American dream. After all, Mexicans account for approximately 25% of all immigrants, both legal and illegal, in the United States. But Claudia wasn't from Mexico. She was from El Salvador and hadn't come north looking for more money or social benefits. She was looking for a chance to live and to make something of her life. Many people in Central America were convinced that they had been invited, or at least promised, that they could come to the U.S. because of pledges that the U.S. military made to citizens as they sought to root out the spread of communism in the region. However, once the American troops had been withdrawn, those pledges had been forgotten by the military, and of course, there was no written record of them ever having been made. Claudia didn't care much about politics. She'd never heard of CNN, MSNBC, or Fox News. Discussing political views was a luxury for people who didn't have to worry about putting a meal on the table every day, or what to do when a family member became ill. She'd never heard of the so-called American dream. She was concerned with survival. It wasn't just a lack of food or the impossibility of economic advancement that drove her from her land. She had faced forced evacuations, rape, and even witnessed executions in her village. Some think the government controls the country, thought Claudia, but I know that the drug cartels and other private concerns control everyday life throughout all Central America. To stay meant dealing with the threat of eviction, robbery, rape, or even murder on a daily basis. The other option was to embark on a long, dangerous journey in the hope that she could find refuge in a place that was rumored to give everyone a fair chance. That was her American dream. For her, the choice was hard but clear. As she bounced blindly along some desolate road that led north from the Texas border, Claudia replayed in her mind conversations she'd had on her way north, when it was still safe to talk to others. She'd told her fellow travelers about the leather shop she'd owned in El Salvador. It wasn't a large shop, she always explained, but it was mine, and I'd create the most beautiful leather belts, purses, and hats. My specialty, what I loved most, was making fine shoes that were beautiful, but also fit like a glove and lasted for years. The people in town loved my shoes, and I loved making them. But then, she didn't have to explain how the cartels and others exerted control over every aspect of life in her town. They demanded payment for protection and harassed the people until there was no money left for things like shoes, and no money available to buy the supplies needed to make them. The images, sounds, and smells from her shop were as vivid to her as the smell of sweat and fear that surrounded her in the back of the cramped cargo van. Still, she dreamed of working in a shop like that again, in a place where she was free from the constant fear that had driven her from her home. She recalled conversations she'd had on the long journey north, in the days when relief had finally taken a step to be free overshadowed the fears that would come later. "What do you think it's really like in America?" someone would ask. Everyone had an opinion. They'd seen images of the homes of the rich and famous. They'd seen pictures of people driving their fancy cars. And everyone looked so well off. People who could afford to be fat surely had to be happy and prosperous. "What? No streets of gold?" laughed Claudia in response to many of the giddy answers. "We don't need streets of gold," replied one traveler, laden with what he could carry on his back. "We just need streets that aren't controlled by the cartels." Claudia reflected that many of the people headed for America had no real idea about what awaited them. They didn't know where they would end up. They didn't know what they'd be doing. The journey was long, hard, and dangerous even before they got to the border. They had traveled on trains, buses, and on foot. The sheer distance of some 1,700 miles was daunting and had deterred many who had dropped off along the way. In addition to the physical challenges of the trip, some of the very things that she dreaded in her home village pursued her on the road. While the caravan offered some degree of safety, they were constantly facing the dangers of robbers, rapists, and murderers. The drug cartels that controlled Mexico laughed at the federal forces that tried to control them. They were a law unto themselves, and the government was powerless to stop them. The atrocities they committed made Claudia's blood run cold. Finally, the southern border of the United States was within reach, and the members of the caravan, weary as they were, felt a new sense of excitement. "Will they let us in tomorrow?" asked one woman. "Will they let us in at all?" asked a wizened older man who spoke with a wisdom and skepticism born of years of disappointment. "We've come this far," sighed Claudia. "This can't be the end of the road for us." And yet, when they finally arrived at the border crossing, instead of being greeted by a shining vision from heaven, they were met by suspicion, callousness, and indifference. It wasn't that the immigration people were evil or uncaring. They were simply overwhelmed. They had limited resources and a seemingly endless demand for access to the United States. It was a feeling Claudia knew well from her days in El Salvador. There were needy people all around her, and yet there was so little she could do, and so few people she could help. She remembered the feeling of frustration that could turn to callousness or anger at a moment's notice. Sometimes disconnecting from the pain was the only way to survive. The American border guards didn't have a clue about the political and societal events that drove thousands to the gates of America. Many of these civil servants couldn't even find Guatemala or El Salvador on a map. All they knew was that there were a lot more people trying to come into the U.S. than they could handle, and it frightened them. It quickly became clear to the refugees that the immigration process was completely inadequate. There was no question among the asylum seekers themselves that there were also those hidden among them who were criminals, drug dealers, and grifters. But that knowledge provided no comfort to people like Claudia. Honest, hard-working people like her were desperate to find shelter in a place where they could work hard for a living without fear of being tortured, raped, or killed. As they waited helplessly on America's doorstep, they talked among themselves about their options. "What can we do?" asked one young man whose face and body gave testament to the long journey behind him. "We can wait here," replied Claudia, "but Mexico doesn't want us any more than the U.S. does. None of us has enough money to make it back home. Do you think the Mexican authorities are going to pay to send us home? And do you think they'll take care of us here? Look around you. Half of the people camped here with us are Mexican citizens. If they're so desperate to leave their own country, what hope do we have?" "So what are our options?" asked a woman who was roughly Claudia's age. "We can't stay in this camp forever." Because she was more educated than many of the other travelers, and because she had been able to do some research, Claudia was able to provide an answer. She grimaced as she said, "There are those among us they call coyotes. Some have been traveling with us for some time. Others show up at camps like this with the promise to take people over the border illegally for a fee." "Who cares if it's illegal?" cried out a young woman holding a baby. "We can't stay here. If they catch us, they'll just send us back, right? But how much money are you talking about to hire one of these coyotes?" "More than you can dream," sighed Claudia. "You will owe them more than you could make in 5 years at home. And these people do not forget or forgive debts. They own you. You will have to work for years, doing whatever they tell you to do until you finally pay off your debt or die. Or they'll take whatever money you have, and they may never show up. "Better to die trying to do something than to die out here in the wilderness," grunted one man, who looked many years older than his years. The trek to America's border had not been kind to him. Lack of food, drink, and sleep wore people down quickly. It was difficult to measure the impact worry had on people, but the evidence was visible. Despite her dire warnings about dealing with the coyotes, Claudia was in full agreement with the man. In fact, she'd already contacted one of these coyotes and had turned over everything of value she had left. Of course, it didn't come close to being enough, but it was enough to get her a spot in the van that now rumbled north. She felt trapped. She couldn't enter on her own, and she had no resources for returning to El Salvador. The Mexican authorities weren't thrilled about helping their own citizens make it home again. Why would they care about a poor woman from El Salvador? So Claudia followed in the footsteps of thousands before her. She essentially sold herself into indentured servitude in return for delivering her safely to the United States. She had no control over where that might be or what she might be doing, and she hated the fact that she had no choices. And yet, she was one of the lucky ones who made it across the border. Sitting in a sweltering, windowless van packed with other illegal immigrants, she wasn't sure she felt so lucky. The trip from El Salvador had consumed most of her meager resources. She had known she would need money when it came time to cross the U.S., even by legal means. She had also prepared for the eventuality that legal entry might not be an option. Nothing, however, could have prepared her for how much money the coyotes would demand to bring her across the border. The exact amount didn't matter. It might as well have been $1 million. She knew the debt would never be paid off. After what seemed like several days of driving, the van stopped in the small town of Smackover, Arkansas. The name meant nothing to Claudia, but to be honest, Smackover, Arkansas didn't mean anything to most people in the United States, and that was exactly why the coyotes stopped there. Smackover was far enough from the Mexican border that they didn't have to worry about border patrols sniffing them out. It was a place where refugees could be hidden out of sight until it was time to move them again. The town had enough infrastructure to allow the coyotes to coordinate the dispersal of their charges to sweatshops or agricultural fields across America, where they could work off their debts. It didn't bother the coyotes in the slightest, knowing that these debts would only continue to grow. They got their cash as soon as they delivered their goods. What happened to their cargo after that was none of their concern. All the coyotes spoke Spanish, and during their brief encounters with their charges, they would pump them for information. By the time the van reached Smackover, the coyotes ferreted out that Claudia was skilled as a leather worker. That pleased them because they could demand a higher price for an illegal with desirable skills. That's why, after a few days, Claudia found herself on yet another road trip in yet another windowless cargo van to a place called Zimmerman, Louisiana, where she would soon put her skilled hands to labor in a sweatshop producing leather goods. The shop was the brainchild of a trust fund baby named Dick Corey, who realized that his trust fund was not the bottomless pit he once thought it was. He'd never worked an honest day in his life, but he managed to come up with a brilliant idea of creating high-end leather goods for people who wanted high-quality, exclusive pieces without having to pay Gucci prices. His vision was to market these goods as, quote, handcrafted leather goods created by expert craftsmen in the USA. Corey knew how to read the tea leaves. He'd picked up on the fact that there were a lot of people who wanted handcrafted quality made in the US goods who were willing to pay a pretty penny for those items. So he priced his goods high enough to appear expensive, but was careful not to go beyond what pocketbooks would tolerate. He also knew that nobody would bother checking the details about where or how these products were made. Once people saw pretty pictures of the goods, they were done thinking. He laughed to himself about how people would overpay for mass-produced individuality. The items he sold weren't custom items, but they had that look and feel, and his presentation of the goods implied that no two pieces were exactly alike, which, unbeknownst to him, was actually true. His carefully crafted online pictures evoked images of old-world craftsmen bent over their benches, tirelessly and lovingly, creating masterpieces of leather. Great photography and carefully crafted messages covered a multitude of sins. The images, however, were a far cry from the reality of what went on in the shop he'd set up near Zimmerman. It was a sweatshop in every sense of the word. Not only did the few employees regularly work 12 to 16-hour days, but the temperatures inside often hovered above 90 degrees in the summer, with humidity to match. Corey figured that since most of his laborers came from warmer, humid climates, they didn't need air conditioning. That was a privilege, however, that he himself enjoyed, ensconced in his sprawling villa overlooking the nearby Red River. He'd picked Zimmerman for a couple of reasons. The practical reason was that it was close to Interstate 49. That made shipping convenient and cheap for him. That was important because his was an online-only operation. His items weren't carried in stores. He knew the marketing appeal of exclusivity, and he knew that people liked buying straight from the source, as if cutting out the middleman made it an even sweeter deal. A glance at his website plainly revealed that the company was registered in rural Massachusetts. Of course, the address in Massachusetts was nothing more than a P.O. box at a dinky little UPS store. No one seemed to notice that the packages arrived from a Louisiana address. The second reason he'd picked the town of Zimmerman was because he was a Bob Dylan fan from way back, and it amused him to no end that he was operating his empire out of a small town that bore Dylan's birth name of Zimmerman. It was an inside joke that was shared with no one. That didn't bother him because he had no real friends with whom he could share his little joke. Of course, Dick Corey needed workers to churn out leather goods he sold online. Getting the raw materials was relatively easy. The cattle skins McDonald's generated every few days in their demand for ground beef could support hundreds of leather workers. Turning the leather into desirable objects was more complicated. He had some workers in his shop who were adequate workers, but they lacked the flair, creativity, and skill to create interesting and evocative pieces of work. That's why he was so excited about his newest employee, who had just arrived from the southern border of the United States. He didn't even know where she was really from, but he'd been told that she was a talented leather worker and had already been involved in creating the kinds of products he wanted to sell. It was why he had paid a premium price for her delivery. Claudia exceeded his expectations. She had a natural flair for design when it came to elegant handbags, shoes, belts, and other leather goods. On top of that, she knew how to make those items and was a gifted teacher as well. She found willing apprentices in the sweatshop. In the early days, all the workers still had dreams of paying off their debts and moving out on their own, and now they had dreams of using their newfound skills to begin a new life. When Claudia first arrived, she found others already hard at work. One other was also from Central America, but some were from Sri Lanka or places in Africa that she'd never heard of. None of them spoke more than a smattering of English. This was by design, so that they couldn't talk and develop relationships or plans. But Claudia overcame any language problems by showing her coworkers exactly how to create the things she'd designed. She discovered that sometimes seeing was even better than hearing or reading about how to do something. Corey sold the shoes they made for $600 a pair. The workers who made them were paid about $5 a piece. Of course, all the money they made went to pay off the debt they'd incurred with the coyotes. The debt was paid to Corey himself. The workers took pride in their handcraft, and somehow it didn't register with them that it takes a lot of $5 shoes to pay off a $10,000 debt. Dick Corey, on the other hand, was doing just fine. He oversaw operations from his sprawling house high up on the hill. It was the largest and most exquisitely appointed house in the whole Zimmerman area. The thing was that nobody in the area even knew it existed. He'd had it built by out-of-state contractors, and the thick trees between his house and the road kept anyone from seeing it. It's not like there were a lot of prying eyes in rural Louisiana, but he wasn't taking any chances. And just in case someone did catch a glimpse of his house, he built it in the antebellum style so that it might pass as an old, unknown plantation. Just to be sure, he'd installed state-of-the-art security around the whole complex. His residence was separated from the workshop and the rest of the world by an impressive gate and a state-of-the-art electric fence. Corey didn't spend much time down in the shop. He wouldn't admit it, but the whole operation made him a little uncomfortable. It wasn't enough to make him stop what he was doing, but he didn't spend any more time in the sweatshop than was absolutely necessary. And he didn't have to look at it. Another copse of trees hid the workshop and the workers' sleeping quarters from his eyes. All he saw from his expansive patio was trees and the river flowing by behind them. The workshop and sleeping quarters for the workers were also surrounded by an electric fence that wasn't nearly as aesthetically pleasing or well disguised as the one surrounding Corey's house. And while the video cameras in his house were turned to the outside to observe potential intruders, the cameras in the workers' area were focused inward to monitor their movements. And while Corey didn't particularly like watching his workers, it gave him some sense of security to know that they were safely tucked in for the night. Even though Claudia and her co-workers turned out fantastic products, their lives didn't become easier. As sales boomed for Dick Corey, the demand for more product also increased dramatically. There was no problem getting more raw materials, but finding additional workers was difficult and expensive. There were few new additions to the workforce, while the workloads doubled and tripled. If the crew didn't meet the increased quotas, their rations were reduced. If they were sick, they had to work anyway. Dick Corey never threatened employees directly, but he employed a foreman whose responsibility was to make sure that enough goods kept coming out to ensure the company's continued growth. The foreman's salary was directly tied to the volume of product that they produced, and he wasn't about to stand for any kind of drop in pay. The workers feared him, and the mental, emotional, and even physical abuse he meted out as the foreman prodded his charges to meet the daily quotas. Claudia began to feel the same sense of despair she'd known in El Salvador, and in the back of the van crossing the U.S. border, it seemed as if nothing had changed. One day, when the group had failed to meet their quota, the foreman cornered her and told her in no uncertain terms that his earnings entitled him to special attention from the local brothel. He then told her that if he didn't have the money to pay for the services he wanted, he would find a way to satisfy his needs without money, at her expense. Terrified and desperate after her encounter with the foreman, Claudia stumbled to a small cluster of trees within the workers' quarters, where she fell face down on the ground, sobbing. With no one else to turn to, she began to pray, pleading for help. She had no idea what form this help would take, but after a few minutes, she rose with a calming sense that somehow her plea for help had been heard, and that she and her co-workers would be delivered. It was one of those spiritual things that defied explanation. A 1,000 miles away, Angie sat on the veranda of a bed and breakfast sipping a cup of coffee. It was a bright, warm morning, so nobody thought twice about her wearing sunglasses as she sat quietly by herself in the sunshine. She, of course, didn't wear the sunglasses to dim the brightness of the sun. She'd seen light much more intense than that before, light that would sear the eyes of any mortal. She wore them so that the humans around her wouldn't see the fire that sometimes flared in her eyes. The staff at the B&B had learned not to disturb her when she sat motionless in her usual spot in the sun for an hour or more at a time. She was a great guest, quiet and keeping to herself. She never caused any trouble. She'd sometimes stay for a week or two at a time, and always paid in advance. And her room was spotless. Her bed linens were always clean, as if she'd never even slept in the bed. She also never seemed to use the towels, and she never had any outlandish requests. Plus, she tipped well, so they had long ago let her sit and enjoy the sun. But Angie wasn't simply sitting and enjoying the sun. She was in what most people would call a trance, but it was something much deeper than that. If they could have seen her eyes, they would have been startled by their reflection. They would have seen no iris or pupil. People sometimes liken looking into the eyes of demons or those troubled by demons as staring into the abyss. With Angie, it was the exact opposite. If someone were able to look closely, they might see swirling stars and shafts of light, almost as if one were staring into the depths of the heavens. And sometimes they would see fire. Although she sat silently, Angie was not idle. She'd had a vision of a Central American woman in trouble, desperately praying for deliverance from a situation in which she was powerless. After a few minutes had passed, Angie stood up, left a payment and a generous tip on the table, and then walked off the veranda and turned into an alleyway. One of the staff from the B&B, seeing the tip on the table, had looked into the alley to say thanks, but Angie had disappeared. He shook his head. It seemed to happen all the time.